My name is Hazel Morrison, and I'm 34 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in a lawyer's office in Denver, staring at a document that's about to destroy my life. It's my parents' new will, and according to this piece of paper, my brother Blake is getting everything. $1.2 million in assets, including the house they just sold for $650,000. I get nothing. Absolutely nothing. The door opens behind me, and I hear my parents' footsteps. When I turn around, they're both smiling, but it's not the warm smile I remember from childhood. It's cold, calculated, almost cruel. My mother crosses her arms and looks me dead in the eye. Hazel, we need to talk about your attitude problem. Before we dive into this nightmare, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you've ever dealt with family drama over money, hit that like button because you'll definitely relate to what's coming. And don't forget to subscribe because this story is about to get absolutely wild. Trust me, you won't believe how deep this family betrayal goes. Now, let me take you back to where this all started, 6 months ago, when my parents made a decision that would tear our family apart forever. 6 months ago, my parents Dorothy and Walter Morrison made what seemed like a smart financial decision. They sold their house in Austin, Texas for $650,000. They were both in their 60s, Dad was 65 and Mom was 62, and they wanted to downsize. The plan was simple: buy a smaller condo and use the remaining money for retirement. But that's not what happened. Instead, my older brother Blake, who was 38 at the time, came to them with what he called a golden opportunity. He wanted to open an upscale steakhouse called Morrison Steakhouse, and he needed investors. He painted this picture of family legacy, of building something together that would make the Morrison name mean something in the restaurant industry. Blake had always been the charmer in our family. While I was the responsible one, working as an accountant and carefully managing every penny, Blake was the dreamer. He had this way of making wild ideas sound not just possible, but inevitable. When he described his restaurant vision to our parents, they were completely swept up in it. He talked about prime cuts of beef, elegant dining rooms, and profits that would set the whole family up for life. What he didn't mention was that he had no restaurant experience, no business plan, and no backup funding if things went wrong. When Blake approached me about joining this family investment, I had to be honest. My husband Owen and I had just bought our first house, and we were stretched thin with mortgage payments, car loans, and all the expenses that come with homeownership. I had run the numbers over and over, and there was simply no way we could contribute anything substantial to Blake's restaurant dream. When I explained this to him, his entire demeanor changed. The charming smile disappeared, and I saw something I'd never seen before: pure resentment. The family meeting where I officially declined to participate was held at our parents' new condo. Blake had prepared this elaborate presentation with charts and projections, clearly expecting everyone to jump on board. When I politely explained that Owen and I couldn't financially participate, the room went silent. Then my mother spoke up, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Hazel, I'm surprised at you. Your brother is offering us a chance to build something together as a family, and all you can think about is your own situation." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I tried to explain that it wasn't about selfishness, it was about financial responsibility, but Blake cut me off. "You've always thought you were better than the rest of us," he said, leaning back in his chair with this smug expression. "Just because you have some fancy accounting job, you think you can look down on your family's dreams." The unfairness of it was staggering. I had never looked down on anyone. If anything, I had always been the one helping family members with their taxes, giving financial advice, and lending money when times were tough. But somehow, my inability to invest in Blake's risky venture had been twisted into evidence of arrogance and selfishness. My father Walter, who had always been the peacekeeper in our family, surprised me by siding with Blake and Mom. "Your brother has worked hard to put this opportunity together," he said, his voice stern in a way I rarely heard. "It's disappointing that you can't see past your own concerns to support family." The word disappointing echoed in my head long after the meeting ended. I had never been called disappointing by my father before, and it cut deeper than I expected. As I drove home that night, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Had I been wrong to refuse? Should I have found a way to make it work financially? But when I walked into our modest house and saw Owen helping our neighbor's kid with his bike, I knew I had made the right choice. We were building our own life, and we couldn't risk everything on Blake's untested dream. I had no idea that this decision would mark the beginning of a family war that would nearly destroy me. 3 weeks after that family meeting, Blake officially received the full $650,000 from our parents' house sale. I found out about it not from my parents or Blake, but from a Facebook post my younger sister Ruby shared. She was 28 and had always been the family's social media enthusiast, documenting every milestone and celebration. The post showed Blake holding an oversized check at a bank, with our parents beaming beside him. The caption read, "So proud of my big brother Blake for making his dreams come true. Morrison Steakhouse is going to be amazing. Family first always." What stung wasn't just being excluded from this major moment, but realizing that everyone had been discussing and planning this celebration without me. I called Ruby immediately, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, I saw your post about Blake getting the money. That's exciting." There was an awkward pause before she responded. "Oh, yeah. Mom and Dad wanted to make it special for him since he's been working so hard on the business plan." When I asked if there had been any kind of celebration, Ruby's voice got even more uncomfortable. "Well, we had a little family dinner last night. Nothing big. A family dinner that I wasn't invited to. That was a first in our family's history. Even during arguments or disagreements, family dinners were sacred. We might not talk much during the meal, but everyone was always included." I pressed Ruby for details, and eventually learned that not only had they celebrated Blake's funding, but they had also discussed preliminary plans for the restaurant opening. My exclusion wasn't accidental, it was deliberate and planned. The grand opening of Morrison Steakhouse happened 2 months later, and it was like watching my family celebrate something I was meant to be ashamed of not supporting. Blake had rented event space, hired a small catering company, and invited what seemed like half of Austin. I discovered the event through social media again, seeing photos of my parents cutting a ribbon with Blake, Ruby giving a speech about family dreams coming true, and dozens of relatives I barely recognized raising glasses and toasts. The most painful photo was one of my parents with Blake, all 3 of them wearing matching Morrison Steakhouse t-shirts. Dad had his arm around Blake's shoulders, and Mom was holding a sign that read "Proud Parents of Morrison Steakhouse Owner." Seeing my parents' pride, knowing how much they had invested emotionally and financially in Blake's success, made me question everything about my decision to step back. That same week, we had what my mother called a family meeting but what felt more like an intervention. Blake, now full of confidence from his successful opening week, decided to address what he called the elephant in the room. According to him, my refusal to support the restaurant had created negative energy in the family. He claimed that several relatives had asked why I wasn't involved, and he was tired of making excuses for my selfishness. "I've been thinking about this a lot," Blake said, pacing around our parents' living room like he was giving a boardroom presentation. "Hazel has always been jealous of any success in this family. When I got into college on a football scholarship, she complained about favoritism. When I got promoted at my sales job, she made comments about how lucky I was. Now that I'm finally building something meaningful, she can't stand not being the center of attention." The accusations were so far from reality that I almost laughed. I had celebrated every one of Blake's achievements, had helped him with his college applications, and had even co-signed for his first apartment when his credit was bad. But somehow, my current financial limitations had been reframed as lifelong jealousy and resentment. Ruby, who I had always considered my closest family member, delivered the blow that nearly broke me. "I hate to say it, Hazel, but Blake has a point. You've always acted like you're smarter than the rest of us because you went to business school. Maybe it's time to admit that you were wrong about the restaurant and support Blake the way family should." Sitting in that room, listening to my own sister echo Blake's twisted version of our history, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. These were the people who had known me longest, who had witnessed every moment of my life, and somehow they had convinced themselves that I was the villain in this story. The worst part was seeing my parents nodding along, their faces reflecting disappointment and frustration with their eldest daughter. When I tried to defend myself, explaining once again that financial inability wasn't the same as lack of support, Blake cut me off with a wave of his hand. "We don't want to hear excuses anymore, Hazel. Either you're part of this family or you're not." The ultimatum hung in the air like a threat, and I realized that my relationship with my family was being held hostage over a business investment I simply couldn't afford to make. What I didn't realize during that confrontational family meeting was that Blake had been orchestrating a much larger campaign against me. Over the following weeks, I started noticing changes in how extended family members treated me. Cousins who used to call regularly stopped reaching out. Aunts and uncles who had always included me in group text messages began responding to my messages with short, cold replies or not at all. It felt like I was slowly being erased from the Morrison family network, but I couldn't figure out exactly how or why. The architect of my social exile was my Aunt Beverly Morrison, my father's 58-year-old sister who had always wielded enormous influence over family dynamics. Beverly had never particularly liked me, mainly because I had chosen independence over the traditional family structure she valued. When I moved away for college, when I chose my career over starting a family immediately, when I married Owen who wasn't from an established family, Beverly had made subtle comments about my choices. Now, Blake's restaurant gave her the perfect weapon to use against me. Beverly organized what she called a family unity meeting at her large house in the suburbs. She invited every Morrison relative within driving distance, about 20 people in total, but somehow forgot to extend an invitation to me. I learned about this gathering the same way I had learned about most family events recently, through social media posts and overheard phone conversations. When I called my cousin Derek, who I had always been close to ask about the meeting, his response chilled me to the bone. "Beverly thinks it's better if you don't come to family things right now," Derek said, his voice uncomfortable but firm. "She says you're going through some kind of phase where you're putting money before family, and she doesn't want that negativity affecting everyone else." The idea that I was going through a phase of prioritizing money was so absurd that I almost laughed. I had spent my entire adult life helping family members with financial problems, lending money I could barely afford, and giving free accounting advice to anyone who asked. During Beverly's family meeting, which I later learned about through Ruby who felt guilty enough to fill me in, Blake presented his version of recent events. According to him, I had not only refused to help with the restaurant but had actively tried to discourage our parents from investing their house sale money. He claimed I had called his business plan stupid and had told our parents they were throwing their retirement away. None of this was true. I had never criticized the restaurant idea itself, only explained why I personally couldn't invest. Beverly used Blake's presentation to launch into what Ruby described as a passionate speech about family loyalty and traditional values. She talked about how previous generations of Morrisons had always supported each other through thick and thin, how they had pooled resources during the Great Depression and stuck together through every hardship. According to Beverly, I represented a new generation that had lost touch with these values, that prioritized individual success over family bonds. The most devastating part of Beverly's campaign was how she reframed my entire relationship with the family. She claimed that I had always been too good for Morrison family gatherings, that I looked down on relatives who didn't have college degrees, and that I used my accounting knowledge to make others feel stupid about money. She pointed to times when I had offered financial advice as evidence that I was condescending, and she twisted my natural introversion into proof that I thought I was superior to everyone else. By the end of that meeting, Beverly had convinced most of the family that my refusal to invest in Blake's restaurant was just the latest example of a pattern of selfishness and arrogance that had been going on for years. Uncle Frank Morrison, who had always been like a second father to me, called me the next day to express his disappointment. "I thought we raised you better than this, Hazel," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. Family means more than money, and I'm sorry you've forgotten that. The group chat that had connected the Morrison family for years suddenly went quiet whenever I posted anything. Messages that used to generate dozens of responses from relatives would get one or two polite acknowledgements before the conversation moved on to other topics. When I shared news about a promotion at work, something that would have been celebrated in the past, the only response was from my cousin Crystal, who wrote, "That's nice. I guess work is going well for you." Even more painful was watching how enthusiastically the family rallied around Blake's restaurant updates. When he posted photos of the dining room setup, he received dozens of supportive comments and promises to visit soon. When he shared news about hiring his first employees, relatives competed to offer congratulations and encouragement. The contrast between their treatment of Blake's successes and their indifference to my achievements made it clear that I had been categorized as an outsider. The final blow came when Crystal, who was 26 and had always looked up to me like an older sister, confronted me at a grocery store we both happened to be shopping at. "I just want you to know that the whole family is talking about you," she said, her young face serious and disapproving. "Everyone thinks you're being really selfish about Blake's restaurant. Beverly says you've always been jealous of Blake and now you're trying to sabotage his success." When I tried to explain my side, Crystal cut me off with a gesture that reminded me painfully of Blake. "I don't want to hear excuses, Hazel. You used to be someone I looked up to, but now I'm not sure you're the person I thought you were." Walking away from that encounter, pushing my shopping cart through the parking lot while fighting back tears, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. The family I had known and loved my entire life had somehow decided I was a villain in a story I didn't even recognize. Blake's restaurant had become more than a business venture. It had become a test of family loyalty that I had apparently failed by not bankrupting myself to support it. 4 months after its grand opening, Morrison Steakhouse was hemorrhaging money faster than anyone wanted to admit. The problems were obvious to anyone with business experience. The location was in a high-rent district with limited parking, the menu was overpriced for the local market, and Blake had no experience managing food costs or staff scheduling. What should have been a 6-month emergency fund had been burned through in half that time, and Blake was facing the harsh reality that running a restaurant required skills he simply didn't possess. Instead of acknowledging these operational problems, Blake decided the solution was more money. He called an emergency family meeting and announced that he needed an additional investment of $200,000 to get through the rough patch. According to Blake, all new restaurants struggled in their first year, and with just a little more funding, Morrison Steakhouse would turn the corner and become the success everyone had envisioned. The request was directed specifically at me. Blake had apparently convinced our parents that since I was the only family member with liquid assets and a steady income, I was obligated to step up and save the restaurant. The fact that my liquid assets consisted entirely of our emergency fund and retirement savings didn't seem to matter to anyone. In Blake's mind, and apparently in our parents' minds as well, my financial stability meant I had a responsibility to bail out his failing business. "This is your chance to prove you actually care about this family," Blake said during the meeting, his desperation masked as righteous anger. "I put everything on the line for this restaurant, and now when I need help, you're going to sit there and count your money while I lose everything?" The emotional manipulation was obvious, but it was working on our parents. Mom was crying, talking about how she couldn't bear to watch Blake's dream die, and Dad was making veiled threats about how family relationships could be permanently damaged by selfishness. When I tried to explain that $200,000 would wipe out our savings and put our house at risk, Blake exploded with rage that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "You want me to fail," he shouted, pointing at me across our parents' kitchen table. "You've been waiting for this restaurant to fail so you could feel superior to me again. You've always resented my success, and now you're going to sabotage me when I need family support the most." My mother's response to this outburst was to comfort Blake while glaring at me with genuine hatred. "How can you sit there and watch your brother suffer?" Dorothy demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "We raised you better than this. We taught you that family comes first, but you become cold and selfish. You care more about your bank account than your own brother's future." The accusations became more personal and cruel as the meeting continued. Dad talked about how disappointed he was in the woman I had become, how I had lost touch with the values they had tried to instill in me. Blake claimed that my refusal to help was proof that I had never really loved the family, that my whole personality was an act to make others feel inferior. Ruby, clearly uncomfortable but still siding with Blake, suggested that maybe I needed therapy to deal with my money issues and learn how to put family first. That night, sitting in my car outside our house, I came closer to breaking than I had ever come in my adult life. The pressure from my family, combined with the guilt they had systematically built up over months, had me seriously considering taking out a second mortgage on our house to fund Blake's restaurant. For about 20 minutes, I sat there calculating how we could make it work, how we could restructure our finances to give Blake the money he needed. Owen found me there an hour later, crying in the driver's seat while staring at our house. When I told him about the family meeting and my thoughts about refinancing, his reaction was immediate and firm. "Hazel, listen to me. That restaurant is failing because Blake doesn't know how to run a business. Throwing our life savings at it won't change that. It will just mean we both go down with his ship." Owen had always been the voice of reason in our relationship, but hearing him spell out the situation so clearly helped me realize how close I had come to making a catastrophic financial decision based on emotional manipulation. The breaking point came the next week when my cousin Derek, who had been one of my closest friends since childhood, showed up at my workplace. Derek was 32, 2 years younger than me, and had always been someone I could count on for support and honest conversation. Seeing him in my office lobby, I felt a moment of relief, thinking that maybe someone in my family had come to their senses and wanted to bridge the gap that had opened between us. Instead, Derek delivered what felt like a coordinated attack on my character and choices. "Everyone in the family is talking about what you're doing to Blake," he said, his familiar face twisted with disappointment and anger. "Aunt Beverly is right about you. You've always thought you were better than the rest of us because you went to college and got some office job. Now Blake needs help, and you're sitting on your money like some kind of miser while your own brother's dreams die." Hearing those words from Derek, who had known me since we were children, who had seen me help family members countless times over the years, felt like being stabbed by someone I trusted completely. The Derek I knew would never have believed I was capable of the selfishness he was describing. But Blake and Beverly's campaign had been so thorough, so systematic, that even my closest family relationships had been poisoned by their narrative. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Derek continued, clearly repeating arguments he had heard elsewhere. "Blake put everything on the line to build something for this family, and you're going to let him fail because you're too greedy to share your success. If you don't help him, you're not welcome at family gatherings anymore. We don't want people around who put money before family loyalty." That ultimatum, delivered by someone who had been like a brother to me, was the moment I realized just how far Blake's manipulation had spread through the Morrison family network. I was no longer dealing with a disagreement about a business investment. I was fighting for my place in a family that had been systematically turned against me by people who were using emotional manipulation to cover up a failing business venture. The morning after Derek's ultimatum, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to defend myself against accusations I couldn't understand, I decided to find out what was really happening with Blake's restaurant. If my family was going to destroy our relationships over Morrison's Steakhouse, I needed to understand exactly what kind of business I was supposedly obligated to support. My accounting background had taught me to look at numbers rather than emotions when evaluating financial situations, and I realized I had been accepting Blake's version of events without seeing any actual data. I hired Rachel Williams, a private investigator who specialized in financial investigations and business fraud. Rachel came highly recommended from a colleague who had used her services during a complex divorce case. When I explained the situation to her, Rachel's first question was whether I had ever seen Morrison Steakhouse's books or any financial documentation about the business. When I admitted I hadn't, she raised an eyebrow and said that was the first red flag in what might be a much larger problem. The investigation Rachel conducted over the next 3 weeks revealed a pattern of financial behavior that explained everything about Blake's desperation and our family's manipulation campaign. Morrison Steakhouse had indeed received the full $650,000 from our parents' house sale, but only $250,000 of that money had actually been invested in the restaurant. The remaining $400,000 had been gradually moved through various accounts before being spent on online gambling sites, luxury purchases, and debt payments that had nothing to do with the restaurant business. Rachel's report included bank statements, transaction records, and even surveillance photos that painted a devastating picture of Blake's secret life. While he had been presenting himself as a dedicated restaurateur fighting to build a family legacy, he had actually been feeding a gambling addiction that had cost him nearly twice what he had invested in the legitimate business. The most shocking discovery was that Blake owed an additional $180,000 to various loan sharks and underground betting operations in Las Vegas, debts that had been accumulating for over 2 years. Armed with this information, I reached out to my childhood friend Sophia Martinez, who had become a successful attorney specializing in family law and financial fraud. Sophia and I had stayed close since college, and she was one of the few people in my life who knew both my family dynamics and my actual character. When I showed her Rachel's report, Sophia's reaction was immediate professional concern mixed with personal outrage on my behalf. "Hazel, this is textbook financial fraud," Sophia explained during our meeting at her law office. "Blake took money that was supposed to be used for a specific business purpose and spent it on personal debts and gambling. If your parents had made this investment through any formal structure, Blake could be facing criminal charges for misappropriation of funds." Sophia helped me understand that my family's pressure campaign wasn't just emotionally manipulative, it was an attempt to use family obligations to cover up what amounted to theft. The most damning piece of evidence Rachel had uncovered was Blake's gambling history. Transaction records showed that he had been betting increasingly large amounts on sports games and online casino games for over 3 years. The pattern was classic addiction behavior: initial small wins that encouraged bigger bets, followed by desperate attempts to win back losses with even larger wagers. By the time he approached our parents for restaurant funding, Blake was already in debt to dangerous people and saw the family money as a way to temporarily satisfy his creditors. While I was absorbing this information, Blake and Beverly were escalating their campaign against me. Beverly had organized another family meeting, this one specifically focused on what she called my ongoing betrayal of Blake and the Morrison family values. According to Ruby, who was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the family dynamics but still afraid to speak up, Beverly had prepared a detailed presentation about why I should be excluded from all family functions until I agreed to help Blake financially. The timing of Beverly's latest attack seemed suspicious, and further investigation revealed why she was so invested in defending Blake's version of events. Rachel discovered that Beverly had received $50,000 from Blake just 2 weeks after the restaurant opened, supposedly as payment for consulting services related to family investments. In reality, Beverly had known about Blake's gambling debts from the beginning and had taken money to help maintain the fiction that Morrison Steakhouse was a legitimate family business venture. Beverly's financial connection to Blake's deception explained her aggressive defense of his character and her systematic campaign to isolate me from family support. She wasn't just enabling Blake's manipulation, she was an active participant in covering up his fraud because she had been paid to do so. The revelation that my own aunt had been deliberately sabotaging my family relationships for money was almost harder to accept than Blake's gambling addiction. The most devastating moment came when I realized how thoroughly Blake's manipulation had infected even my relationship with my parents. Dorothy and Walter hadn't just been convinced that I was selfish, they had been systematically lied to about both Blake's business prospects and my supposed attempts to undermine him. Blake had told them that I had been spreading rumors about the restaurant, that I had been trying to discourage customers from visiting, and that I had even attempted to sabotage his relationships with suppliers. None of these accusations were true, but Blake had been so convincing, and Beverly had been so supportive of his version of events, that my parents now believed their eldest daughter was actively working against their son's success. Understanding this helped me realize that my family's treatment of me wasn't really about my refusal to invest. It was about a false narrative that had been carefully constructed to hide Blake's gambling addiction and financial fraud. Armed with Rachel's evidence and Sophia's legal analysis, I finally understood what I was really fighting against. This wasn't a family disagreement about money or business investments. It was an elaborate cover-up designed to hide criminal behavior and shift blame onto me for refusing to enable that behavior. The family I thought I knew had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had been, but they had been turned against me in the process. The confrontation I had been dreading and preparing for happened on a rainy Thursday evening at our parents' house. Blake had called another emergency family meeting, this time including even more relatives than usual. Beverly was there, of course, along with Uncle Frank, Aunt Linda, Derek, Crystal, Ruby, and about a dozen other Morrison family members. The agenda, according to Blake, was to make a final decision about my place in the family if I continued to refuse helping with the restaurant's financial crisis. When I walked into that crowded living room carrying a thick folder of documents, the atmosphere was already hostile. Beverly had clearly been building up to this moment for weeks, and the assembled relatives looked at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. Blake sat at the center of the group like a wounded hero, playing his role perfectly as the struggling entrepreneur being sabotaged by his selfish sister. Before anyone says anything, I announced, standing near the fireplace so everyone could see me clearly, I think you all need to see what Morrison Steakhouse money was really spent on. The room went quiet, clearly not expecting me to take the offensive in what they had planned as my final judgment. Blake's face went pale, but he quickly recovered and tried to interrupt me. Hazel, we're not here to listen to more of your excuses, he said, standing up and trying to take control of the room. We're here because you've been selfish and destructive, and this family needs to decide whether we're going to enable your behavior anymore. But I was ready for his manipulation tactics now, and I wasn't going to let him control the narrative anymore. I opened the folder and began distributing copies of bank statements, transaction records, and surveillance photos that Rachel had compiled. Blake didn't spend $650,000 on a restaurant, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. He spent $400,000 on gambling debts and online betting. Morrison Steakhouse only received $250,000, which is why it's failing. The reaction was immediate chaos. Blake jumped up from his chair, his face red with rage and panic. She's lying, he shouted, pointing at me like I was attacking him physically. She hired some private investigator to spy on our family and make up evidence because she can't stand that I'm successful. But the bank statements and transaction records were right there in black and white, and several family members were already studying them with growing shock and understanding. Beverly tried to regain control by attacking my methods rather than addressing the evidence. How dare you hire strangers to investigate your own family, she declared, her voice shaking with indignation that seemed increasingly forced. This is exactly the kind of paranoid, destructive behavior we've been talking about. You've gone completely off the deep end, Hazel. But Uncle Frank, who had been one of my harshest critics, was studying the gambling transaction records with the attention of someone who understood financial documents. Blake, he said slowly, looking up from the papers, these show you betting $50,000 at a time on basketball games. Where did this money come from? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Blake's attempt to answer only made him look more guilty. Those records are fake, Blake insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. Hazel is so desperate to avoid helping family that she's paying people to fabricate evidence against me. Can't you see how sick this is? However, Rachel had done her job well, and the evidence was too comprehensive and detailed to dismiss as fabrication. Transaction dates, account numbers, and even security camera footage from casinos showed Blake gambling away money that was supposed to be building his restaurant. The moment when everything shifted was when I presented the photographs of Blake at various Las Vegas casinos, time-stamped during periods when he had told the family he was working 18-hour days at the restaurant. The images showed him at poker tables, slot machines, and sports betting windows, clearly comfortable in environments that suggested this wasn't his first time gambling. Several relatives gasped when they saw the photos, and Ruby actually started crying. Dorothy's reaction was the most devastating to watch. My mother stared at the photographs for a long time, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally heartbroken understanding. "Blake," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you told us you were working late. You said the restaurant was keeping you busy every night." When Blake tried to explain, claiming the photos were taken during business research trips, even he seemed to realize how ridiculous that sounded. Walter's response was quiet rage, the kind of controlled anger that was somehow more frightening than shouting. "You took our house money and gambled it away," he said, each word carefully measured. "You let us believe Hazel was being selfish when you were lying to us about everything." Blake tried to maintain his position, claiming that the gambling was a small part of a larger business strategy, but the evidence was too overwhelming for anyone to believe him anymore. The revelation about Beverly's $50,000 payment from Blake created another wave of shock through the room. When Uncle Carl saw the bank transfer records showing money going from Blake to his sister, his reaction was immediate and angry. "Beverly, you knew about this gambling and you took money to keep quiet," he demanded, his voice rising with each word. "You helped him manipulate all of us while he was stealing from Mom and Dad?" Beverly's defense was weak and increasingly desperate. She claimed the money was legitimate payment for business consulting, but when pressed for details about what services she had provided, she couldn't give any specific examples. Her involvement in the cover-up was becoming clear to everyone in the room, and the family members who had been her strongest supporters were starting to look at her with the same suspicion they had previously directed at me. The final blow came when Derek, who had delivered that devastating ultimatum to me just weeks earlier, stood up and apologized publicly. "Hazel, I owe you a huge apology," he said, his voice heavy with shame and regret. "I believed Blake's story about you being selfish, and I said terrible things to you based on lies. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to get your side of the story before judging you." By the end of that evening, the entire dynamic of our family had shifted. Blake's reputation was destroyed, Beverly was exposed as a co-conspirator, and I was finally vindicated after months of being treated like a villain for refusing to enable criminal behavior. But the victory felt hollow because of how much damage had been done to relationships that had taken decades to build. The aftermath of that explosive family meeting created fault lines through the Morrison family that seemed impossible to repair. The relatives who had been most vocal in supporting Blake and condemning me were now struggling with the realization that they had been manipulated into attacking an innocent family member while defending someone who had stolen from his own parents. The guilt and embarrassment were palpable, but so was the defensiveness that comes when people realize they've been made fools of. Uncle Carl Morrison and his wife Aunt Linda were among the first to acknowledge how wrong they had been about the situation. Carl was 57 and had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, so discovering that he had been completely deceived by Blake was a blow to his self-image. Linda, who was 55 and had been particularly harsh in her criticism of my supposed selfishness, called me the day after the confrontation to offer a tearful apology. "I kept thinking about all the times you helped us over the years," Linda told me during that difficult phone conversation. "When Carl was out of work, you did our taxes for free and helped us figure out how to restructure our debt. When our daughter needed college application help, you spent hours working with her. I don't know how I convinced myself you had suddenly become selfish and greedy." The conversation with Linda was both healing and heartbreaking because it highlighted how thoroughly Blake and Beverly's manipulation had warped everyone's perception of reality. People who had known me my entire life, who had witnessed countless acts of generosity and family support, had been convinced to forget all of that based on my refusal to make one specific financial sacrifice. The power of coordinated emotional manipulation to override decades of evidence was terrifying to contemplate. Ruby's journey back to reality was more complicated because she was younger and had been more completely under Blake's influence. At 28, she looked up to Blake in a way that made his betrayal particularly devastating for her. The day after our family confrontation, she called me crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, her first words were an attempt to process how completely she had misjudged the situation. "I keep thinking about all the times Blake asked me for money over the past few years," Ruby said, her voice shaky with the effort of reassessing memories she had previously interpreted differently. "He always had some emergency or opportunity that needed just a little bit of cash to work out. I thought he was just having bad luck, but now I'm wondering if he was gambling that money too." Ruby's revelation about Blake's pattern of borrowing money from family members opened up another dimension of his financial deception. As she started sharing details with other relatives, a pattern emerged of Blake consistently asking for loans that were never repaid, always with compelling stories about temporary setbacks or promising opportunities. Ruby alone had lent him over $15,000 in the 2 years before the restaurant, money she now realized she would never see again. However, not everyone in the family was ready to accept the new reality about Blake's behavior. Blake himself continued trying to control the narrative, now claiming that his gambling was a recent development brought on by the stress of running the restaurant. According to this new version of events, he had only started betting as a way to try to win back money for the business, and his addiction was a symptom of his dedication to family success rather than evidence of long-term deception. Some family members, particularly those who were closest to Blake or who felt most embarrassed about their previous treatment of me, were receptive to this revised explanation. Blake's ability to generate sympathy even while being exposed as a liar and thief was remarkable to witness. He positioned himself as a victim of circumstances, a loving brother who had made desperate choices while trying to build something for his family's future. Dorothy and Walter's response to learning about Blake's gambling addiction was complicated by their roles as both victims of his deception and enablers of the family dynamics that had allowed it to continue. Mom was devastated by the realization that her house sale money had been gambled away, but she was also defensive about the family's treatment of me. Admitting that I had been right about Blake's unreliability meant acknowledging that they had emotionally abused their daughter for months based on lies. The most dangerous development was Blake's escalating desperation as his lies were exposed and his financial situation became unsustainable. The $180,000 he owed to loan sharks and underground betting operations hadn't disappeared just because his family now knew about his gambling. If anything, his creditors were becoming more aggressive in their collection efforts as time passed without payment. Blake's response to this pressure was to threaten suicide if the family didn't rally around him and find a way to pay his debts. He claimed that the exposure of his gambling had made his life unbearable, and that he couldn't face the shame of disappointing everyone who had believed in him. The threat was obviously manipulative, but it was also effective in creating panic among family members who were already feeling guilty about the situation. My mother's reaction to Blake's suicide threats was to become hysterical with worry and to start blaming me for driving him to such desperation. "If you had just helped him in the beginning, none of this would have happened," she sobbed during a phone call that felt like being attacked by someone who was drowning. "Now my son is talking about killing himself because you had to prove you were right about everything." The emotional manipulation was still working, even after the evidence of Blake's deception had been presented clearly and undeniably. Dorothy couldn't process the reality that Blake's problems were the result of his own choices and actions. Instead, she needed to blame someone else for the family's pain, and I remained the most convenient target for that blame despite being the only family member who had acted responsibly throughout the entire situation. Owen's support during this period was crucial for my emotional survival. While my family continued their complicated dance of guilt, anger, and misplaced loyalty, Owen provided a consistent voice of reason and perspective. "Blake is threatening suicide because he's facing consequences for his actions," Owen reminded me during one of my lowest moments. "That's not your responsibility to fix, and it's not your fault that he chose gambling over family." The family division deepened when Blake's creditors started making direct contact with our parents' home. Phone calls from collection agencies and unexpected visits from intimidating men looking for Blake made it impossible to maintain the fiction that his problems were minor or temporary. Walter and Dorothy were forced to confront the reality that their son's gambling had put them in potential physical danger, not just financial difficulty. The moment that finally shattered Blake's remaining credibility happened on a Tuesday morning when Dorothy called me, hysteria evident in her voice even through the phone. "Hazel, there are men at our door asking about Blake's debts," she whispered, as if the visitors might be able to hear her. "They say he owes them money and they want to discuss payment arrangements. I don't know what to do." I immediately called Owen and asked him to drive to our parents' house while I contacted Sophia for legal advice. When Owen arrived, he found two large men in expensive suits sitting in our parents' living room, calmly explaining to Walter and Dorothy that their son owed their organization $140,000, and that payment arrangements needed to be made immediately to avoid complications. These weren't typical loan sharks or street-level criminals. They were representatives of a sophisticated gambling debt collection operation that had extensive records of Blake's borrowing and betting activities. They had copies of signed agreements, transaction records, and even recordings of phone conversations where Blake had promised specific payment dates that had already passed. The professionalism of their documentation made it clear that Blake had been involved with serious money lending operations, not just casual betting with friends. When the debt collectors learned that Blake had recently received over $500,000 from his parents and had spent it on unauthorized activities, their interest in the family intensified significantly. From their perspective, Walter and Dorothy weren't just Blake's relatives, they were potential sources of recovery for money that their son had borrowed under false pretenses. The legal implications of the situation became clear when Sophia arrived at our parents' house to help navigate the crisis. After reviewing the debt collector's documentation and interviewing Walter and Dorothy about their financial arrangements with Blake, Sophia realized that the family was dealing with potential criminal fraud, not just poor business decisions. Blake took money that was specifically designated for a business investment and used it for unauthorized personal purposes, Sophia explained to the gathered family members. If your parents had made this investment through any formal business structure, Blake would be facing embezzlement charges. As it stands, he may still be liable for fraud, and these debt collectors have legitimate claims against any money he received from family members. The revelation that our parents might be legally responsible for some of Blake's debts because they had provided him with money that he had fraudulently diverted was devastating for Walter and Dorothy. They had trusted their son completely, never requiring any formal documentation or oversight of how their house sale money was being used. Their parental love and trust had made them vulnerable to financial fraud that could cost them their retirement security. Blake's response to being confronted by professional debt collectors was to completely abandon his previous stories about business investments and temporary setbacks. Faced with people who had extensive documentation of his gambling activities, he finally admitted the full scope of his addiction and deception. The confession was remarkable both for its completeness and for how it revealed the calculated nature of his manipulation of family members. According to Blake's tearful admission, he had been planning to use family money to pay gambling debts for over a year before approaching our parents about the restaurant investment. The business plan, the charts and projections, the emotional appeals about family legacy were all elements of an elaborate con designed to access money that could satisfy his creditors while maintaining his image as a responsible family member. The most shocking revelation was that Beverly had known about Blake's gambling debts from the beginning and had agreed to help him manipulate family dynamics in exchange for payment. Her campaign against me hadn't been based on genuine belief in family loyalty. It had been a paid performance designed to deflect attention from Blake's criminal activities and shift blame onto a family member who was threatening the success of their deception. When confronted with evidence of her financial relationship with Blake, Beverly initially tried to maintain that she had provided legitimate business consulting services. However, when Sophia pointed out that accepting payment to help cover up fraud could make her legally liable as an accessory, Beverly quickly changed her strategy and began providing information about Blake's activities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Beverly's cooperation revealed the full extent of Blake's planning and deception. He had spent months studying our family's dynamics and individual financial situations before deciding that I was both the most capable of providing significant funding and the most likely to initially refuse. His entire approach had been designed to use family pressure and emotional manipulation to overcome my rational financial objections. The systematic nature of Blake's manipulation was horrifying to contemplate. He had deliberately exploited his parents' love and trust, his siblings' family loyalty, and extended relatives' social dynamics to create a coordinated pressure campaign designed to force me into funding his gambling debts. Every family gathering, every emotional conversation about family values, every accusation about my selfishness had been orchestrated to serve his fraudulent purposes. Ruby's reaction to learning about the premeditated nature of Blake's manipulation was particularly painful to witness. As the youngest family member, she had been completely deceived by Blake's performance and had genuinely believed she was defending family values by supporting him against me. Realizing that her passionate defense of family loyalty had actually been supporting criminal fraud was devastating for her sense of judgment and family identity. Walter and Dorothy's response to the full revelation was a combination of heartbreak, anger, and terror about their financial future. They had not only lost their house sale money to Blake's gambling, but they were now potentially liable for additional debts that could force them to sell their condo and liquidate their remaining retirement savings. The son they had trusted completely had destroyed their financial security while manipulating them into emotionally abusing their daughter. The final piece of Blake's deception was revealed when Sophia's investigation uncovered evidence that he had been planning to approach me for additional money even before the first family confrontation about the restaurant investment. Bank records and recorded phone conversations showed that Blake had been discussing strategies for extracting more funding from family members, with me specifically identified as the primary target for future manipulation. 6 months have passed since that devastating Tuesday when Blake's gambling debts finally caught up with our family, and the Morrison family dynamics have been completely transformed by the experience of discovering how thoroughly we had all been manipulated. Blake is currently in a residential addiction treatment program in Arizona, working through the 12 steps while also beginning the long process of making financial amends for the money he stole and gambled away. The program costs are being covered by the sale of our parents' vacation cabin, money that Walter and Dorothy decided to invest in Blake's recovery rather than their own retirement comfort. The legal resolution of Blake's situation was complex and expensive, but Sophia managed to negotiate arrangements that protected our parents from the worst financial consequences of their son's fraud. The debt collectors agreed to structured payments that would be manageable for Walter and Dorothy's fixed income, and Blake signed agreements that legally transferred responsibility for his remaining gambling debts to him personally rather than leaving our parents liable for money he had taken under false pretenses. Our family's journey through therapy has been painful but necessary for rebuilding relationships that had been poisoned by months of manipulation and emotional abuse. Dr. Patricia Williams, our family counselor, helped us understand how Blake's systematic lying had exploited normal family loyalty and trust to create an environment where rational thinking became impossible. Learning about the psychology of manipulation and financial fraud helped explain how good people could be convinced to act against their own values and relationships. Dorothy and Walter's healing process has been the most complicated because they were simultaneously Blake's primary victims and unwitting accomplices in the family's mistreatment of me. Their guilt about believing Blake's lies and participating in the emotional attacks against me has been almost as difficult to process as their grief about losing their house sale money to gambling debts. Therapy has helped them understand that being victimized by fraud doesn't make them responsible for the damage Blake caused to family relationships, but forgiveness has been a gradual process for everyone involved. My own journey toward healing has involved learning to set boundaries with family members while also rebuilding trust with people who had been manipulated into treating me terribly. The hardest lesson has been accepting that loving my family doesn't mean accepting responsibility for their poor choices or sacrificing my financial security to enable destructive behavior. Blake's addiction and fraud weren't problems I could have solved by giving him money. They were serious issues that required professional intervention and legal consequences. Ruby has become an unexpected ally in the family's recovery process. Her experience of being completely deceived by Blake's manipulation has made her determined to learn about financial responsibility and family dynamics in ways that will protect her from future exploitation. She started attending financial literacy classes and has become much more careful about family members' requests for money or emotional support for questionable decisions. Beverly's role in the family has been permanently changed by the revelation of her paid participation in Blake's fraud. While she avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with investigators, most of the Morrison family has chosen to limit contact with her. The trust that had made her influential in family dynamics was completely destroyed by the discovery that she had accepted payment to help manipulate and isolate family members. Her isolation serves as a reminder that enabling destructive behavior, especially for personal gain, has serious consequences for family relationships. The most important lesson I've learned from this nightmare is that family loyalty must be based on truth and respect, not blind obedience to destructive demands. Real love sometimes means refusing to enable harmful behavior, even when that refusal is unpopular or misunderstood. My decision to decline investing in Blake's restaurant wasn't selfish, it was the responsible choice that ultimately protected my family from even greater financial devastation. Owen's unwavering support throughout this crisis has shown me the difference between healthy family relationships and the toxic dynamics that had developed in the Morrison family. His willingness to stand by me when my entire extended family was against me demonstrated the kind of loyalty that's based on character and values rather than manipulation and guilt. Our marriage has been strengthened by navigating this crisis together and learning that we can trust each other's judgment even when external pressures are overwhelming. The financial aftermath of Blake's fraud has been a learning experience for our entire family about the importance of formal documentation and oversight when family members mix personal relationships with business investments. Walter and Dorothy have established new protocols for any future financial assistance to family members, including written agreements, specific timelines, and regular reporting requirements. These safeguards feel unnatural in a family context, but they're necessary protection against the kind of exploitation Blake was able to carry out. Perhaps the most profound change in my perspective has been understanding that protecting myself and my family from financial abuse isn't selfish, it's responsible stewardship of resources that could be used to help family members in legitimate ways. By refusing to enable Blake's gambling addiction, I preserved financial stability that has allowed Owen and me to genuinely help other family members with real needs, including contributing to Blake's treatment costs and helping our parents navigate the legal complexities of his debt situation. The question I'm asked most often by friends and colleagues who know our story is whether I regret not just giving Blake the money he demanded, since the family conflict caused so much pain for everyone involved. My answer is always the same: enabling addiction and fraud would have caused far more damage in the long run, both financially and emotionally. Blake needed intervention and treatment, not more money to gamble away, and our family needed to learn about the dynamics that had made us vulnerable to manipulation. Looking back on this experience, I realized that the most dangerous part of Blake's manipulation wasn't the lies he told about his business plans or even the money he stole from our parents. The most dangerous part was how he convinced people who loved me to believe that I was capable of cruelty and selfishness that was completely contrary to my character. Rebuilding those relationships has required not just forgiveness, but a collective commitment to never again let financial pressure override our knowledge of each other's fundamental nature. The Morrison family is smaller now, but it's more honest. We've learned that real family support means helping each other make responsible decisions, not blindly funding each other's destructive behaviors. We've learned that love sometimes means saying no, and that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't betraying family values. Most importantly, we've learned that trust, once broken by fraud and manipulation, must be rebuilt slowly through consistent actions rather than emotional appeals. Sometimes the greatest act of love is saying no, especially when that refusal forces people you care about to confront problems they would rather hide. Family loyalty doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior, it means caring enough about each other to insist on honesty, responsibility, and respect. The hardest lesson is that protecting yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is allowing yourself to be destroyed by someone else's choices, even when that someone is family you love deeply. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your financial security and keeping peace with family members? How do you handle situations where family loyalty conflicts with responsible decision-making? Share your thoughts in the comments because these are challenges many families face, especially when money and emotions get mixed together. If this story helped you think about your own family dynamics, please hit that like button and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about our experience. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about navigating family relationships and standing up for yourself when it matters most. Remember that loving your family doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being for their poor choices. Thank you for listening to our story, and I hope it helps you trust your own judgment when family pressure tries to convince you to act against your better instincts. Take care of yourselves, and remember that the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries even when they don't like them.